American Free Press Sample Audio Version, Issue 43 and 44, October 23 and 30, 2017. Thanks, Mr. Trump. African American group applauds president for bringing jobs to inner cities. Economic policies credited with lowest black unemployment rate in 17 years, by John Friend. Despite the persistent efforts of the hostile fake news media to discredit and demonize every move President Donald Trump makes, evidence continues to mount demonstrating that the economic prospects for all Americans, including Black Americans, are looking brighter and brighter with each passing day. Trump's populist, America First economic agenda has prioritized creating and maintaining jobs in the U.S., reinvigorating American manufacturing and industry, cutting taxes, and dismantling or restructuring trade deals that favor multinational corporations or other nations. The president has repeatedly called for prioritizing American workers and American businesses, putting the interests of U.S. workers and industry first, a stark departure from virtually every American presidential administration in modern memory. Black Americans in particular have benefited economically under Trump. The unemployment rate for Black Americans fell to 7% in September, a 17-year low. 1 year ago, the Black unemployment rate was 8.3%, and had reached a high of 16.8% in March 2010 at the peak of Obama's reign. A variety of Black conservatives and activists have praised the Trump administration for the improved economic conditions for not only Black Americans but all Americans. Project 21, an initiative of the National Center for Public Policy Research, endeavors to promote the views of Black conservatives whose entrepreneurial spirit, dedication to family, and commitment to individual responsibility has not traditionally been echoed by the nation's civil rights establishment. According to the Project 21 official webpage, leaders and representatives of Project 21 applauded Trump's economic policies and the resulting consumer and worker confidence in the economy. Common sense measures to reduce regulation are a major step in improving American economic conditions, Project 21 Advisory Board co-chair Horace Cooper recently stated. Once Congress steps up to reduce taxes and repeal Obamacare, the markets and the economy will skyrocket, taking such good fortunes to Black America and the rest of the nation. Unsurprisingly, this positive news has received little coverage in the fake news media, which is largely hostile to Trump and his America First agenda, with the Black unemployment rate falling to its lowest point since April 2000, and considering the persistently high levels of double-digit employment that existed during most of the previous administration. This news should really be garnering more attention, noted Dr. Derek Green, a Project 21 member who focuses on economics and Black unemployment. This should be a source of economic optimism because the job market is expanding and improving overall, particularly among American Blacks who were hit hard during the sluggish, so-called economic recovery touted by our previous president. It bears remembering that the Black unemployment rate at the point it skyrocketed, it was at or near 15% on 9 occasions, and near or above 16% 24 other times. While still too high for my liking at 7%, the Black unemployment rate has significantly improved since the days of double digits, by almost any objective measure. Workers and consumers appear to be more confident in their economic prospects than at any other time since before the economic crisis in the mid-2000s. Americans of all racial and ethnic backgrounds are seeing their economic prospects rise, especially since Trump took office. Hopefully, Trump will continue to work to implement his populist, America First foreign and domestic policies. 2 rare books saved from the memory hole. We have some very good news to report this week. Thanks to popular demand, 2 very important books by Victor Thorne are now back in print courtesy of Victor's son and the tireless work of our production team at American Free Press. We're happy to note that, as we go to press on October 19th, the books, 9-11 Evil, Israel's Central Role in the September 11, 2001 Terrorist Attacks and 9-11 Made in Israel, are back in our warehouse in significant quantity, and we have resumed taking orders for them. Longtime readers of AFP know Victor well. Up until his death on August 1, 2016, he was considered one of the foremost authorities on the Clintons and their criminality. Only prolific author Roger Stone comes even close to the decades of work that Victor put into researching, documenting, and speaking out about the Clinton crime family. Victor was a giant in the alternative press, having written some 60 books along with dozens of smaller chapbooks and thousands of newspaper articles. Victor will most certainly go down in the history books as our most prolific writer and author, bar none. Over the years, AFP has sold tens of thousands of his books, including perhaps his most popular ever, Frontman, Obama's Darkest Secrets Revealed, as well as his trilogy on Bill and Hillary Clinton, which documents in great detail their involvement in corruption, drug running, sexual assault, and even murder. Today, many of Victor's books are hard to find. In some cases, they are going for hundreds of dollars on the internet. Thankfully, the Victor Thorne Legacy website has granted AFP, and only AFP, the rights to reprint these books. These two rare books of Victor's were in desperate need of a publisher. There were a few copies remaining from independent wholesalers who bought directly from Victor. Unfortunately, there were also copyright pirates and greedy vendors trying to gouge people for $60 a copy. But now we have both of these books in new editions with all new covers. Best, they are still just $15 each. However, in order to get as many of them into circulation as possible, we are offering both for just $25. We want to see Victor's work in front of the public. Understand that some groups and individuals think these books are anti-Semitic, because Thorne's premise was that Israel was heavily involved in pulling off the 9/11 attacks. The truth is, however, when Victor started researching 9/11, he had no idea the connections he would find. He had no problem accepting that a group of Muslims carried out the attack because they were angry at the U.S. for destroying the Middle East and siding with Israel. But that is not where the trail led Victor. After much research, he concluded that there was just too much evidence pointing to Israel's involvement, and he felt it was critical he document this. Victor's final legacy is the enormous body of work he left us, which explored not just 9/11 but a tremendous array of subjects ranging from basic New World Order conspiracies to the very nature of reality itself. If you haven't picked up copies of 9/11 Evil and 9/11 Made in Israel, we recommend you do so as soon as possible, because, today, there is a concerted effort to silence outspoken researchers and organizations in this country. AFP just weathered a major assault on our financial well-being when banking giant Wells Fargo arbitrarily canceled our credit card processing account. We're not holding our breath that that's all they have in store for us, so act now before we're hit again. See page 22 for more details on this special deal on Victor's books. Christopher J. Petherick, Executive Editor. Santilli cops plea to avoid prison, fine. Internet radio show host pleads guilty to charge stemming from Nevada standoff. By Mark Anderson. There have been new surprising developments in the upcoming trial of Cliven Bundy, his sons, and several of his supporters in the U.S. District Court in Nevada. In the first twist, Internet radio personality Pete Santilli pled guilty, October 6, and was released pending sentencing. His attorney, Chris Rasmussen of Las Vegas, confirmed for AFP by phone about 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time that day. Santilli is one of the defendants in the next trial, which had been set to begin with jury selection on October 30. The trial that would have included Santilli involves the federal government trying cattlemen Cliven Bundy, his sons Ammon and Ryan Payne. Following his plea deal, Santilli will no longer be a defendant. Two other defendants, O. Scott Drexler and Eric Parker, who are being retried on some counts for a third time, will join the others in this second of three planned trials of all the defendants charged in the Bunkerville standoff. The second turn of events is that both the prosecution and defense sought and secured yet another delay in these complicated proceedings, this time due to fear that the highly emotional aftermath of the recent deadly shooting during a country music concert outside Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino in Las Vegas would adversely impact the attitudes and opinions of jurors. It's worth noting that the October 30th trial could be subject to change again, given the bumpy track record of these multiple defendant trial proceedings, which the federal government has been largely losing so far. Santilli, who shot extended live-stream video footage of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge building in eastern Oregon, was jailed for his role in that affair. Although he was cleared of charges in Oregon, Santilli was kept behind bars and transferred to Nevada to stand trial because he had also taken part in the spring 2014 Bunkerville, Nev standoff. That peaceful confrontation saw Bundy, his sons, and other supporters gathered to protest the policies and conduct of the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, and other federal agencies that unsuccessfully attempted to confiscate Bundy's cattle over a grazing fee dispute. In Nevada, Santilli pled guilty to a felony count of obstruction of justice, based on the government's assertion that he used his own vehicle to impede the movement of a BLM truck during the attempted cattle impoundment. Attorney Rasmussen believes the government may be willing to consider the prison time that Santilli has already served, behind bars since January 26, 2016, as sufficient punishment for that felony charge. But a reading of the plea memo shared with AFP by Rasmussen shows that the government reserves the right to impose a longer prison term, possibly 6 years, when Santilli is sentenced, probably in January. Meanwhile, 2 pending defense motions, one to exclude Oregon-related evidence in the government's Nevada case against Santilli and another to challenge the government's claim that Santilli could not excuse his Nevada actions because of his journalistic background, are now moot, Rasmussen added. According to court documentation, Santilli copping a guilty plea to this single felony obstruction charge requires, under penalty of perjury, that he accept the following government-sourced statements as true and correct. Regarding the standoff in southern Nevada, beginning on or around March 28, 2014, federal law enforcement officers from the United States Department of Interior, Bureau of Land Management, and National Park Service were engaged in the official duties of executing federal court orders to remove and impound cattle trespassing upon federal public lands in and around Bunkerville, Nevada, the cattle belonging to Cliven Bundy, a local rancher. Defendant Santilli knew that Cliven Bundy and his sons, Ammon, Dave, Mel, and Ryan, collectively, the Bundys, and others associated with them, planned to thwart, impede and interfere with impoundment operations. On April 9, 2014, defendant Santilli used force to prevent officers from discharging their duties by using his vehicle to block BLM law enforcement officers and civilian employees as they were performing their duties related to the impoundment. Defendant Santilli drove his vehicle straight toward a BLM law enforcement officer's vehicle, preventing the officer and the rest of the convoy behind him from being able to move forward. The officer ordered defendant Santilli to move out of the way, but defendant Santilli continued to block the convoy's path. Defendant Santilli finally reversed his vehicle out of the path of the convoy only after the officer repeated the command several times. By using force to block the convoy, defendant Santilli allowed others to surround the convoy and threaten the occupants of the vehicles by force of violence and fear, inducing the officers to leave the place where their duties were required to be performed. Defendant Santilli acknowledges that all of the above took place within the state and federal district of Nevada. The maximum penalty for conspiracy to impede or injure a federal officer, the formal name of this count against Santilli under 18 U.S.C. Section 372, is 6 years imprisonment, a fine of $250,000, or both. But the plea memo shows that Santilli owes no restitution under this charge, nor will he be required to forfeit any of his assets, provided he meets the strict terms of his supervised release until he's sentenced. He must not violate any federal, state, or local laws, is restricted from any significant travel, and among other things must avoid any known association with anyone who's breaking any law, nor consensually possess a gun or any other item deemed a weapon by the government. Failing to show up for a hearing or other procedural matter would also result in this deal being dissolved. Rhode Island tackles geoengineering, by Mark Anderson. In late September, Rhode Island became the first state to enact legislation that calls on officials to examine how atmospheric modification programs, commonly referred to as geoengineering, are affecting the Earth. The measure in question is the Geoengineering Act of 2017, H. 6011, which was introduced by State Rep. Justin Price, R., earlier this year. The Rhode Island General Assembly finds that geoengineering encompasses many technologies and methods involving hazardous activities that can harm human health and safety, the environment, and the economy of the state of Rhode Island. It is therefore the intention of the Rhode Island General Assembly to regulate all geoengineering activities, the bill says. Specifically, the bill would provide that a person seeking to engage in geoengineering activities would require a license from the Director of the Department of Environmental Management, an April 2017 legislative news release explained, adding, "Geoengineering is defined as the intentional manipulation of the environment, involving nuclear, biological, chemical, electromagnetic and/or other physical agent activities that affect changes to Earth's atmosphere and/or surface, cloud." Seeding has long existed as a form of weather modification. One example is the U.S. military's clandestine Operation POC-PI, which illegally applied a cold cloud modification system using 3 WC-130 planes to shoot silver iodide flares into the skies to induce heavy rains to muddy the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The purpose was to stop or slow North Vietnamese troop convoys, but there's a growing recognition that much else is going on above us, and has been for a long time. Many people call those crisscross vapor streaks that often march otherwise beautiful blue skies chemtrails, a broad term referring to visual evidence of an apparent program involving atmospheric spraying that allegedly goes beyond creating rainfall. Perhaps the most common claim is that atmospheric aerosols are being sprayed to deflect sunlight and keep the Earth from getting too warm, in keeping with the climate change theory that world temperatures are unnaturally rising, and humanity's industrial emissions are chiefly to blame. Specialists interviewed by this AFP writer regarding geoengineering have some weighty concerns, especially regarding the bill's regulation provision. There are concerted efforts in America and in Europe, nuclear physicist and atmospheric researcher J. Marvin Herndon told AFP, that are aimed at geoengineering governance. All of those efforts, to my knowledge, fail to tell the full truth, fail to admit that geoengineering has been taking place covertly for decades. He continued, "The more I learn of the horrific adverse health consequences for humans and other biota, the more I realize that there is only one acceptable act of governance, the total and complete ban on placing any and all substances into the air we breathe for any reason." Herndon did add, "Representative Justin Price deserves major kudos for not burying his head in the sand as most, virtually all, civic leaders do." Price's bill requires advance disclosure of precise geoengineering plans before they're carried out. Otherwise, geoengineering should be banned, said Price, who told reporters, "I think the public should not take the idea of geoengineering lightly, because we have no idea what irreversible damage could be done to the planet or our atmosphere. Either the entire process is completely transparent to the public, with strict oversight, or I say, it absolutely should not happen." This bill, introduced on March 24 and passed by the House September 19 by a 67-0 vote, which created a 5-member commission to study and provide recommendations on the regulation and licensure of geoengineering. Yet this issue runs even deeper than many may suspect. Jim Lee of South Carolina, a researcher on geoengineering, especially weather modification, spoke at length on such matters at last December's Freedom Force International Conference entitled Global Warming, an Inconvenient Lie in Phoenix, Aris Lee credits Price for waking people up about geoengineering, but there already are broader laws on this subject that have long been on the books, such as the Federal Weather Modification Reporting Act of 1976, that should be utilized to bring clandestine atmospheric modification into full public view and establish a means of policing, punishing or banning it. The Rhode Island bill's text says that violators would be punished $500,000 per occurrence with not less than 190 days in jail, and per occurrence could mean per day. With the Rhode Island bill, there's no way to punish anybody, Lee countered. It doesn't say anything about how you catch somebody engaging in geoengineering flights without a license. The 24-hour prior notice in the bill is okay, but we have to deploy atmospheric sensors to catch violators in the act. As he understands it, most atmospheric modification programs are deep state and by definition would be hard to thwart under the Rhode Island bill, given the limited jurisdiction and land area of that small eastern state. Mark Anderson is AFP's roving editor. You can email Mark Anderson directly at truthhound2@yahoo.com. Homelessness and infectious diseases combine to create health disaster. California declares a state of emergency. By Dave Gahaly. The breakdown of the United States is manifested in many ways, but perhaps no way illustrates the decline of this once great nation more than its swelling homeless population, and, with it, diseases that were once seen only in third world countries. The numbers back up what many of us suspect. According to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's November 2016 annual homeless assessment report to Congress, on a single night in 2016, 549,928 people were experiencing homelessness in the United States, indicative of the disaster. Two separate outbreaks of hepatitis A in California and Michigan that began last year and have killed dozens of people are threatening to spread across the country. And public health officials have very few tools in their arsenal to stop the wave of contagion. On October 13, California Governor Jerry Brown declared a state of emergency, which will allow state health officials to buy additional doses of the hepatitis A vaccine to try to halt the outbreak, the country's second largest in more than 20 years. The only one larger occurred in Pennsylvania in 2003, when almost 1,000 people caught hepatitis A from contaminated green onions. The outbreak, which began in San Diego's homeless community last year, has now spread into other regions. Los Angeles and Santa Cruz counties are now experiencing outbreaks. It has gotten so bad in San Diego that contractors have started blasting the city's downtown streets with bleach. Hepatitis A is a viral infection that involves the liver and makes people sick for maybe a month or so. Dr. Jane Orient, the chairman of the Pima County Aris Medical Society's Public Health Committee for about 30 years and the president of Doctors for Disaster Preparedness, told American Free Press in an exclusive interview, they become jaundiced, and they may have nausea and vomiting. Dr. Orient continued, it is generally a self-limited disease, although it is contagious, and people generally get over it and do fine and are immune to it afterwards. It is generally transmitted in contaminated food. It's a fecal-oral route that is excreted in the stool, and if you contaminate the food with it, then that's how it's usually transmitted. Although the San Diego outbreak does not appear to involve food handlers, but rather people are getting it from the environment, because, I guess, in San Diego they have a particularly filthy environment. AFP asked Dr. Orient why a first-world nation like the United States has seen 19 people die from the disease in the San Diego area and 14 people die so far in the Detroit area, with over 1,000 infected in both regions. I think that we're just seeing a breakdown in our civilization, she said, which includes standards of cleanliness that have been accepted for decades at least and maybe for centuries. Why are we going back to the time when they denied the germ theory of disease? The germ theory of disease, Dr. Orient explained, means that disease is transmitted by microscopic organisms that you can acquire by drinking dirty water or contamination of your food. that these are bacteria or viruses that grow and multiply in your body and that make you sick. This is the most important reason why third world countries have such high rates of diseases. They do not have clean water and sanitation. AFP asked why she thinks the germ theory of disease is not being addressed by those in power. I think it's a matter of political correctness that would involve critiquing things like allowing people to wander through the streets and live in a way that endangers the health of the whole population, she explained. It seems that there are people that care more about political correctness than they do about the health of the average American citizen. I think they consider themselves to be sort of immune, they're protected, they live in an elite community, and they're in charge of things. They're not like the rest of us deplorables, who are barely getting by on what we can earn in this deindustrializing society, and I think they just really don't care about the average patient. AFP asked if she believes that unfettered immigration is contributing to this and other outbreaks. "Oh, I think it definitely is," she answered. "We have people coming into the country that are not screened medically in any way, and sometimes are deliberately dispersed throughout the country, and go to public schools and infect children with diseases to which the children have never been exposed before and they have no immunity," she continued, "that was probably responsible for outbreaks of hundreds of cases of the enterovirus D68, F68, that sent a lot of American children to intensive care units. Some of them became paralyzed because it is a disease somewhat like polio to some people. This probably came in from Central America where it's endemic in the population. It doesn't usually make people, who live there, very sick because they have some immunity to it, but American children just don't, as several California counties are offering free hepatitis A vaccine shots to the homeless in order to stem the tide of the outbreak." AFP asked Dr. Orient her opinion on the vaccinations, which are being almost forced on the homeless. "I just think that mass imposition of any type of medical intervention is a very bad idea," she said. "It's contrary to our civil rights, and it's also just a very imprudent idea, because a lot of times we don't find out about the bad effects of the medical things we do until it's too late." Dr. Orient warned further about vaccines. "I think that people who deny that vaccines can have lifelong disabling, very serious complications is rampant," she said. "Vaccine manufacturers have virtually absolute immunity for any type of liability, so they're really quite protected. Even if they lie and cover up or are negligent about doing safety studies." American Free Press asked if the elites had a more nefarious agenda. "I think there are people who really want to destroy the United States of America, to destroy our economic and our military power, because we are the biggest impediment to their ideal of the global regime," she said. "I think the United States is in serious danger, existential hazard really, of loss of the freedom on which our prosperity depends, as well as a decent civilized life." Dr. Orient summarized her feelings on this disturbing issue. "Large populations are using the streets and outdoor areas as a toilet," she said. "There used to be punishment for merely spitting on the sidewalk. If we tolerate third world hygiene standards, we will have third world diseases. We have got to break the chain of transmission by just cleanliness. We don't have a vaccine for every disease that exists. We can't vaccinate everybody for everything." Trump moves forward with plan to limit immigration. Democrats say border security demands unreasonable. By the AFP staff, for the first time in nearly 50 years, Americans may have a chance to actually debate stopping mass illegal immigration into the United States. Senator Edward Kennedy, D-Mass, opened the immigration floodgates by eliminating numerical caps and opening up massive migration to the United States. America's failure in Vietnam opened up even more loopholes in the 1970s, followed by a deal in 1986 between Kennedy and President Ronald Reagan, all of which resulted in the 11 million to 40 million illegal immigrants, depending on differing estimates, living in the nation today. Supporters of President Donald Trump thought the president had flip-flopped on an America First immigration policy last month when he met with Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, NY, and House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, Calif. to work on an immigration bill Republicans and Democrats could support. The Democrats said they thought the president would extend the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals (DACA) program protections in exchange for border security measures. Trump gave Congress 6 months to come up with a legislative fix before so-called Dreamers began to lose their status. Trump opened negotiations on immigration reform October 8, a Sunday night, sending members of Congress a letter outlining 71 demands in exchange for some form of amnesty for about 800,000 illegal aliens. The plan is a step back toward an America First immigration policy. Trump's plan would reduce the 1.1 million people admitted to the United States annually by limiting immigration by certain family members of U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents. Those with the ability to speak English or with a pending offer of high-paying employment will likely be considered, but those conditions were not explicitly spelled out in Trump's wish list. The president's guidelines include many of the same provisions included in the Reforming American Immigration for Strong Employment (RAISE) Act, which has been sitting in the Senate Judiciary Committee since February. Extended family members and those categorized as unskilled lose most in terms of allowances, while immediate family members and skilled workers earn high points in a new merit-based system under RAISE. The legislation, introduced by Sens. Tom Cotton, R.Arc, and David Perdue, ARGA, would create economic growth and raise American worker wages through prioritizing skilled immigration and cutting current immigration levels by roughly half, according to the authors. Trump also wants loopholes fixed in the law that prevents removal of unaccompanied alien children that arrive in this country unless they are victims of human trafficking. Further, the president wants the burden of proof placed on juveniles, to prove that reunification with both parents is not viable due to abuse, neglect, or abandonment, and that the applicant is a victim of trafficking. The president wants 370 more immigration judges, performance metrics for immigration judges, and money to hire an additional 1,000 U.S. immigration and customs enforcement attorneys, with sufficient support staff. Trump asks for even more, including U.S. funding, not Mexican, for a border wall. The question is, what will he settle for? Democrats say they are revolted by the president's proposals. We told the president at our meeting that we were open to reasonable border security measures alongside the DREAM Act, but this list goes so far beyond what is reasonable. This proposal fails to represent any attempt at compromise, Pelosi and Schumer said in a joint statement. The list includes the wall, which was explicitly ruled out of the negotiations. If the president was serious about protecting the Dreamers, his staff has not made a good faith effort to do so. Pseudo-conservatives like Sens. Lamar Alexander, 10, Bob Cornyn, Texas, Bob Corker, 10, Mitch McConnell, Chi, Lindsey Graham, SC, Jeff Flake, Ares, and John McCain, Ares, and Reps. Mike Kaufman, Kahlo, Steve Scalise, Law, and Paul O'Ryan, WISC, seek amnesty, according to the Immigration Control Organization Numbers USA. Media watchdog group catches shocking NIT admission on tape. Reporter exposes official New York Times anti-Trump policy, reveals editor's bias, conflicts of interest, strange ties to Antifa, by John Friend. Project Veritas, an independent nonprofit media and watchdog organization founded by James O'Keefe that seeks to expose corruption and misconduct in both the public and private sphere, continues to reveal the New York Times and some of its leading contributors and editors as the partisan, biased, and unprofessional hacks the American public is coming to know them as part of Project Veritas's ongoing American Pravda series, which began in earnest this summer with a detailed exposure of CNN's anti-Trump bias and blatant promotion of fake news stories. An undercover reporter with a media watchdog and investigative outfit captured a leading video editor for the New York Times on film exposing himself as an unprincipled, unethical, and dishonorable stooge for the anti-Trump establishment. In the recently released video by Project Veritas, Nicholas Dudich, who serves as audience strategy editor for New York Times Video, candidly admits that he and his so-called media organization are not objective in their coverage, particularly of Trump. "No, I'm not objective," Dudich proudly concedes on video. "That's why I'm here." Dudich also admitted that the Times slants its coverage of Trump in an effort to discredit and demonize the populist billionaire who has upset the ruling political and media establishment with his America First positions and stinging attacks on what Trump accurately calls the fake news media that have manipulated and deceived the masses in this country for far too long. Prior to working for the Times, Dudich worked on the political campaigns of both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, revealing his partisan nature. In the video, Dudich also admitted to once being involved with Antifa, the radical and oftentimes violent coalition of far-left activists who regularly protest conservative and right-wing rallies and events. Antifa and their allies are also prone to physically attacking Trump supporters, and often attempt to shut down and disrupt conservative gatherings and events, publicly expose right-wing activists in an attempt to get them fired from their jobs, and otherwise cause mayhem and violence in cities across the United States. "Yeah, I used to be an Antifa punk once upon a time," Dudich explained to the undercover Project Veritas reporter. Dudich went on to bizarrely admit that James Comey, the former director of the FBI, asked him to join Antifa as a protected FBI asset to gather intelligence about the radical movement. "I joined that stuff for them, the FBI," Dudich told the undercover reporter. "I was an asset. Dudich's purpose," he explained, was to gather information and to assess whether Antifa was a real threat to the government and society. Dudich also told Project Veritas that Comey was his godfather, and that his father and mother have known Comey and his wife for a really long time. He admitted that he should have recused himself when covering the Comey trial, given his alleged close personal ties to Comey. However, Dudich's father, who was contacted by Project Veritas, denied his son's claims, stating that Comey is not Dudich's godfather and that he doesn't even know James Comey. The bizarre and quite revealing investigative video series once again exposing a major American media outlet produced by Project Veritas has been released as a three-part series as AFP goes to press, and is well worth watching in its entirety. The video series can be viewed on YouTube or on American Free Press Net, AFP's website. The fact remains that Nick Dudich lies and he's a gatekeeper at the New York Times, O'Keefe stated following the release of the investigative report, and that fact should be worrisome to the bosses at the paper of record. Who else are they letting spread misinformation in their name? Top-tier treason and the USS Liberty. Liberty survivors, Philip F. Nelson document U.S. treason and high-seas slaughter, by S.T. Patrick. Philip F. Nelson's new book, Remember the Liberty, Almost Sunk by Treason on the High Seas, seeks to out the American politicians responsible for the planning, execution, and cover-up of the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty in 1967. In tracing the planning of the June 8 attack back to 1965, Nelson has written a work that holds President Lyndon B. Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara responsible. In 1979, Liberty survivor James M. Nsjr wrote the first full treatment concerning the Israeli assault on the unarmed U.S. naval ship. After the release of his book, Ns pursued further research at the LBJ Library in Austin, Texas. Within that research, Ns found a misfiled document that detailed the minutes of a meeting held by a 303 committee in April 1967. The 303 committee was responsible for all covert CIA operations within the Johnson administration. The 303 committee consisted of CIA Director Richard Helms, former ambassador to the Soviet Union Foy Kohler, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Earl Wheeler, Deputy Secretary of Defense Cyrus Vance, and National Security Advisor Walt Rostow. Rostow also headed a separate White House group that consisted of Johnson's most adamantly Zionist advisors. McNamara was often used by LBJ as the key liaison and chief executioner of the covert operations birthed by the 303 committee and the other groups. The minutes of the 303 committee meeting, held 2 months before the attack on the Liberty, referenced an operation called Frontlet 615. Operation Cyanide was found within the subparts of Frontlet 615. The 303 Committee used Frontlet 615 as a code name for the pending six-day war between Israel and Egypt. As planned, the war was scheduled to begin on June 15. The Americans had agreed to provide equipment, officer training, and the limited use of aircraft to the Israelis. Operation Cyanide was a provocative false flag that called for an Israel Defense Force attack on a U.S. ship. The assault on the unarmed ship would use unmarked fighter jets so that the destruction could then be blamed on the Egyptians, and the Americans could enter the war on the side of Israel. It was not the first time Johnson had dabbled in false flag operations. Years earlier, he had tasked National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy with Plan 34A in Vietnam. Bundy was charged with constructing a series of provocations that would cause the North Vietnamese to attack American destroyers, that is, Gulf of Tonkin. Some historians cite Tonkin as the primary reason for Johnson's 1964 win over Senator Barry Goldwater, our era's. In a decision that confounded LBJ, Israel began its war with Egypt 10 days early. The USS Liberty was rushed from its position off the Horn of Africa to the Mediterranean Sea. The Liberty had been chosen as the victim of Operation Cyanide. In Remember the Liberty, Nelson recalls the tense confusion and abandonment Admiral Lawrence Guice experienced as the Liberty was being attacked. Guice later relayed the tale to Chief Intelligence Officer David Lewis, who agreed not to reveal the information until Guice had died, which he did in 1987. Guice explained to Lewis that Johnson had ordered 2 sorties of fighter jets recalled, one that had been en route to the Liberty 10 minutes after the attack. Johnson had also recalled 2 A-4s, launched from the USS America within minutes, armed with nuclear weapons and headed for Cairo, Egypt. McNamara called Guice and instructed him to recall the aircraft. "We're not going to war over a few dead soldiers," McNamara told Guice. McNamara, expecting the Liberty to sink within the hour, told Guice that he could order another sortie of fighter jets in 90 minutes. When the hour and a half had passed, Guice prepared to order assistance. McNamara again instructed him to recall the order. Guice demanded to speak to the president, who was standing next to McNamara. Johnson confirmed to Guice that he should recall the wings. He told Guice that he didn't care if the Liberty sunk to the bottom of the Mediterranean. He was not going to embarrass his ally. Upon assuming the presidency after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Johnson had told Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs Golda Meir in 1963, "You've lost a great friend, but you've found a better one." He promised Ms. Meir that there would be no repeat of the Eisenhower incident of 1956. I could rebutted Johnson, who had attempted to persuade the president to back off on sanctioning Israel. The threat of sanctions was levied by Eisenhower after Israel had refused to release lands in the Sinai Peninsula. In Remember the Liberty, Nelson further details the political maneuverings that make Johnson, McNamara, and LBJ's administration culpable in the 1967 attack on American sailors off the coast of Egypt and Israel. A part of the proceeds from Nelson's work are donated to the Liberty Veterans Association. Phil Giralda speaks candidly with AFP. Former CIA agent finds out there is a limit to free speech, even amongst conservatives. By Dave Gahary. George Orwell once said, "The further a society drifts from the truth, the more it will hate those that speak it." That ominous warning was clearly on display last month when Philip Giraldi, one of the heavyweights who has been able to cross the line between the alternative media and the established media, was banned from writing for the American Conservative magazine, where he had been a contributor since its inception, because they didn't like an article he wrote, not for them, but for another publication. Giraldi, born in New Jersey and educated at the University of Chicago and the University of London, served in U.S. Army intelligence during the Vietnam War and was a CIA operations officer, that is, agent, for 17 years. Since his time with the agency, Giraldi has been writing for several websites and magazines about national security issues and most particularly about the War on Terror. He has also been the executive director for the past 7 years of the 30-year-old Council for the National Interest, CNI, founded by former U.S. diplomats outraged by the U.S. policy in the Middle East, which was favoring Israel very heavily and damaging our other interests in the region, explained Giraldi in an exclusive interview with American Free Press. CNI's objective is to change U.S. policy to make it more aligned with U.S. interests and less with Israeli interests, he added. The hullabaloo over some words started September 19 when Giraldi penned a 1,483-word piece entitled "America's Jews Are Driving America's Wars, Shouldn't They Recuse Themselves When Dealing with the Middle East?" The story may have been relegated to appealing to the choir, if not for a chance event. Giraldi explained what happened. "Valerie Plame is a former CIA officer like myself," he began. "She's best known for her involvement with her husband, Joe Wilson, who was in Niger to see if Iraq was buying uranium. This was before the war against Iraq. Wilson came back and said, 'No way, this had never happened,' and when he did that he was punished, but his wife was punished worse. She was a serving CIA officer, undercover, and Scooter Libby, who was an advisor to Vice President Cheney, and an ardent Zionist, I might add, was so angered by this that he leaked her name and identity to the media, the Washington Post, which picked up on it." He continued, "She has been punished again, because she made the mistake of seeing my article online and reading it and then making a comment that it was interesting material. She got jumped on by all and sundry of the Jewish oligarchy in the media and she apologized repeatedly, but they didn't let up on her for a whole week. I suspect that the fact that she got into the story, and the story then made national news, was what made the story have the kind of currency that it got. I think if she had not been involved, my story would have been like other articles that I've written where people will say, 'He's just another crackpot, he's an anti-Israeli crackpot.'" Miss Plame sent the article out to her followers on the social media platform Twitter, and the Jewish oligarchy in the media used the anti-Semitic trick to get her to grovel and genuflect. The upside of Miss Plame's tweet was the exposure Giraldi's article received, as well as a follow-up piece he wrote on October 3, entitled "How I Got Fired, Exposing Jewish Power in America Has Real Consequences." The original article's been viewed about 150,000 times, Giraldi said, and the comments, responding to the online article, are up to about 1,500. The second article has had about 60,000 views and I think it just broke 1,000 in terms of comments, and some of my older articles also found a new readership as a result and are approaching 50,000 views, so it certainly had a dramatic impact in terms of getting the message out. Considering all the exposure his articles had received, AFP asked if the mainstream media reached out to him for comment, as they were relentlessly skewering him. The short answer is, no, he said. No established mainstream-type outlets have gotten in touch with me, even though the story has been all over the place. It was in the Washington Post, it was in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, it was everywhere. It was on MSNBC, CNN, but nobody has gotten in touch with me to talk about this. However, from the alternative media, I've been run off my feet, in terms of doing interviews, in terms of talking about what this all means. Giraldi continued, "Unfortunately, we are seeing the classic exploitation of the heavy Jewish presence over representation in the media and entertainment industries, to make sure these kinds of stories don't get out. How long they are going to be able to do that, I don't know. I've long felt that what the Israelis have been doing to the Palestinians and also to all of their neighbors is totally indefensible. So how long do you keep this fiction going? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that." Giraldi explained to this newspaper what he wrote about and why it caused a stir. The article was about what I was describing as Jewish power, the ability of Jewish groups and individuals to distort our foreign policy in the Middle East to benefit Israel and to the damage of the United States, he said. And I think what set these people off was the fact that I didn't use a euphemism about who these people were. I said that they were Jewish. And very often you'll see people writing about Middle East policies and they'll use expressions like the Israel lobby or Zionist or neoconservatives, but they are fudging the basic issue. The basic issue is that this is Jewish money. This is Jewish people with access to the political class and with lots of money, and creating these foundations and organizations that only exist to benefit the Jewish state. Giraldi was emphatic that he was not talking about all Jews. He said he was only referring to a select few, not all Jews by any means, he said, but I was indicting these people by name. I mentioned who they were and what the organizations were. These organizations are, as far as I'm concerned, committing treason. The article made a few recommendations as well, in order to return this once great nation to the people it was created to serve. Actually, I made 2 proposals, he explained. I said, look, if you've got a guy like Bill Kristol, a leading neoconservative and great lover of Israel, on television, and he's talking about the Middle East and Middle East policy, it might be nice to have a label underneath to tell people who are listening that they don't know about him, that this is a guy who's partisan, and it was kind of a light-hearted comment, because I knew this was never going to happen, but I immediately got jumped on by the usual crowd, like Alan Dershowitz, for this outrageous, anti-Semitic slur, and the other proposal I made was that for Jewish officials in the government who are involved with policy making, I said, well, look, if you're Jewish and you have strong feelings about Israel, when the issue of what the policy should be in Syria or in Iran or indeed in Israel, you should recuse yourself, just like a judge would do in a trial in which he had a personal interest. It seemed to make extremely good sense to me to suggest that, and, of course, I got bombed for that one, too. Shortly after the article appeared online, Giraldi got a call. I received a call from the editor, at the American Conservative, about 2 days after it came out. Giraldi explained, telling me that it was completely unacceptable by their standards, and as a result they were terminating their relationship with me. AFP asked if his firing sets a dangerous precedent. Yeah, we're in danger, he said, because I think the example of what happened to me will keep anyone else from crossing that line and using what I refer to as the J word, and I think a lot of people have already figured that out. One of the founders of the American Conservative was Pat Buchanan, and his 2003 article, Whose War? A neoconservative clique seeks to ensnare our country in a series of wars that are not in America's interest, about Jewish political power, set the stage for the anti-war magazine. That's the irony about this whole thing, Giraldi said. Pat Buchanan became famous, or infamous, depending on how you want to look at it, when he wrote that article denouncing the war in Iraq, and he basically said the same thing that I did. And so here we have the irony of the guy who founded the magazine 15 years ago, and here I'm continuing this tradition of asking the same questions he was asking, and I get fired for it. AFP asked what he felt has transpired between the time Buchanan wrote his article and now. I think what has happened is that everybody in the publishing industry, which has changed dramatically in the past 15, 20 years, is scrambling for the same dollars, looking for money to survive, he said. I suspect what's happened with the American Conservative, like many other publications, is that they have to basically triangulate where their money is coming from and they move toward what they think is the center, and that means that views that are even quite legitimate, which I feel my viewpoint was, are considered to be too dangerous and too risky. In this case it was too dangerous and too risky even to have me around. One of the bright spots of this rather sad affair is the support Giraldi has received. I've had a lot of calls from friends and people whom actually I didn't even know, Giraldi explained, telling me that, look, it's about time that we change the way we think and talk about this issue because there clearly is a superbly well organized and funded cabal out there which is doing a lot of damage to the United States, and we have to talk clearly about what this means. Giraldi next addressed another glaring example of Jewish control over America's political institutions most painfully illustrated through Senate Bill 720, Senator Benjamin Cardin's, DMD, Israel Anti-Boycott Act, which would make it a felony for U.S. citizens to support boycotts of Israel and Israeli settlements, punishable by at least a $250,000 fine, with a maximum penalty of a fine of $1 million and 20 years in prison. AFP covered this topic in the October 9th and 16th issue on page 15. In the Senate, there are 49 co-sponsors, 36 Republican and 13 Democrat, and 261 in the House, where it was introduced by Peter Roskam, RL, from both sides of the aisle. Naturally, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee has made the anti-First Amendment measures passage one of the group's top lobbying priorities for the year. I had lunch yesterday with a university professor and he told me his tale, Giraldi said. He teaches a course in international relations, and as part of the syllabus he had an article that was talking about the Middle East, and the author of the article, this was not him, it was the author of the article, had a comment about Israel and its neighbors. The comment was essentially that Israel has very strict immigration laws, but Jewish Americans who support Israel want open immigration in the United States. The article was basically pointing out that there's a contradiction in the way Jewish supporters of Israel see the world, and this professor was admonished for being an anti-Semite and was almost fired as a result. Giraldi concluded the interview by alluding to the obvious. When all is said and done, the punishment that has been meted out to me and Valerie Plame proves my point. The Friends of Israel rule by coercion, intimidation, and through fear, he said. If we suffer through a catastrophic war with Iran, fought to placate Benjamin Netanyahu, many people might begin to ask why, but identifying the real cause would involve criticism of what some American Jews have been doing, which is not only fraught with consequences but something that also will possibly become illegal thanks to congressional attempts to criminalize such activity. We Americans will stand by mutely as we begin to wonder what has happened to our country, and some who are perceptive will even begin to ask why a tiny client state has been allowed to manipulate and bring ruin on the world's only superpower. Unfortunately, at that point it will be too late to do anything about